G'day, welcome to Trevor White Sailing. Today I'm going to talk about cruising sails. So we are on sailboats. We use sails to propel ourselves across the oceans. Occasionally we use a motor, but our motor is definitely the alternate. And it's our redundant power system. So we shouldn't be relying on it all the time. And most of us choose sailing because it's the most economical way to sail around to places. My yacht has 300 litres in the main tank, another 100 litres in fuel caddies. So that gets me about 4 to 5 days of motoring, depending on the conditions. So it's not very far, versus a dedicated motorboat that can probably do 5 to 10,000 nautical miles and then refill up. So we rely on our sails. I definitely rely on my sails. When I'm sailing across the Southern Ocean, I'm sailing up through the Pacific. You've got 1,000-mile legs, 1,000 nautical miles, 2,000 kilometres, with not much other than a couple of islands in the middle of nowhere. So you rely on your sails. If you're sailing from the States, you're sailing for probably 30 days, for your first landfall. And again, it might be another long one when you get into French Polynesia. Once you get past there, it's not as long. It's probably 2 to 3 days, maybe 5 days at a stretch. New Zealand is probably one of the big stretches for a lot of sailors. It's about a week from the islands down to New Zealand, a week from New Zealand back to the islands. A week as in, 7 to 10 days. But it's interesting, I've been watching, cruising sailors and what they do and how they do it. I've been sailing since '96 when I first bought an offshore cruising boat, and I sailed from the Gold Coast back to Perth around the bottom. I learned a lot in that trip, made a lot of mistakes. Luckily I didn't tear any of my sails because they were in reasonably good nick. When I bought my current boat, Tintin, the sails were shit. The boat had sat in a mooring unloved for several years, and the chap who owned it was quite old. The main was completely rooted, and the genoa, which was relatively brand new, had been left on the furler and had rotted away. The UV had got through the UV cover and the sail, and had just been flogged. So a relatively new genoa was almost ruined. These things happen. It's also why I managed to get the boat quite affordably. But when I was looking at putting new sails on that boat, I had to go through the sail locker and see what was already there. And fortunate for me, Tintin had quite a lot of sails. I had another genoa, another jib, a second main. Admittedly, the second main was almost as bad as the first main. But I had staysails, storm jibs, trysails. No, I didn't have a trysail. I went and bought a trysail. And I had a mizzen. And the mizzen was in average condition. And, I was planning to sail across the Southern Ocean, a 3,000-mile journey up to Queensland. So it's a fair journey through some of the worst seas in the world. And I didn't have a huge amount of money because I just bought a boat, and I had to do a lot of things. I had to re-rig it, had all the running rigging, lots of things. The motor looked like it had to be replaced at the time. I didn't do that for several years, but I was just bleeding money like it was going out of fashion. So I started to try and be clever about what I was doing. I pulled out the old sails, and I had 2 older sails that were 40 years old. And I am still using those sails 10 years later. I have got 50-year-old sails on Tintin. They were made by UK Sails in Holland, and I'm still using them every season. The last few seasons, up and down to the Pacific, I am running those sails. And I have the genoa that was on the boat. I had that cut down to a jib, and that is my backup sail. It's quite a bit lighter, but those 2 main sails are 50 years old. They don't have the greatest shape, but I'm still sailing along at 7 and 8 knots with those shitty old 50-year-old sails. The main, on the other hand, the main on the boat when I bought it was rooted. It was falling apart. The sail cover had worn thin from UV. Perth is it's very hard with UV light there. And So I end up tossing the main, and I found a laminate main. So it was laminate material. It was a delivery sale for a Hunter 34, which happened to be the perfect size for my boat, with a couple of minor adjustments. Added a third reef, and I got a sale for under $1,000, which would have cost me $6,000 in Perth at that time. And I got 6 years out of that sale before it fell apart. Laminate sales are typically not the highest quality. They're quite okay for sailing. And they typically hold up quite well until they fall apart. Like UV just gets to them at some point and then they just start disintegrating. And that's what happened to mine. But over the course of that time, you had to repair that sail several times. But it did get me all the way through the Southern Ocean, hove to in big seas, up into New Guinea, all around Queensland, down to Tassie, back out to New Zealand, back up into the Pacific, where it finally got torn apart in a cyclone. It's not a bad way to go. But it's interesting when I look at boats. I look at a lot of sailboats coming across Pacific, and they have fuck all sails. They have a main and a genoa, and that scares the shit out of me. Like, I'm thinking, how the hell do you sail across the Pacific with 2 sails? It is ridiculous. Some of them, if you're lucky, will have a spinnaker or a genoa, a code 0, maybe. But more and more I'm seeing cruising boats, production boats, with a main, with 2 reefs, and a genoa, and no storm sails. And maybe a code 0 or a Jenica or something like that. If they're adventurous, they'll have a spinnaker, because it is a downwind run from Panama across Pacific, and why wouldn't you run a spinnaker? But often, and more often, I'm seeing boats with their sails blown out. Like, the main is torn, the genoa is torn, like ripped through the guts. It's just damaged with UV light, and it fails, or they're just carrying too much sail in a storm. And you do get some pretty big weather in the Pacific. It's not all downwind gin and tonics. Sometimes it's blowing 45 knots, 50 knots, and more. And quite often you can get consistent winds of 20 to 30 knots. That does load up your sails. And some of these people, like I said, they're running 2 reefs. They're running reefs like you run a race boat in around the bay. And I think that is very short-sighted. And hence they're overpowered. They're overpowering the rigs. They're overpowering the boat. Must be wearing out the crew, and they're tearing sails. And that can be prevented. I think at the very least, a boat coming across the Pacific should have a genoa, a jib, a storm jib, and a trysail. You could probably get away with it, the trysail. The trysail's bloody handy. It's a sail you don't use very often, but if in a big storm coming, you can pull down your main, you can put up a trysail, and you don't even need a track. You can tie these things up these days, and you can protect your main, which is your most valuable sail you have on the boat. New main might be $20,000 for a 45-foot mono, and even more for a cat. So why wouldn't you have a cheap $500 sail to do that? But I'm seeing boats with a genoa, and that really, I'm quite astounded. I don't know what they're thinking when they leave, the US, or they're leaving Panama, and they've only got 2 sails on board. It's like having 1 anchor. Why would you do it? If something goes wrong, you have no anchors. So I guess I'm talking about what I think is a minimum amount of sails for a sloop and a ketch. I think a boat sailing across the Pacific should have a genoa, a jib, a storm jib. They're your working sails. It should have a mainsail with a minimum of 3 reefs. If it's a huge sail, 4 reefs, so you can get some of that working sail down, particularly when you're in a decent storm. You know, you can choose to carry a trysail. You don't have to, but you know they can protect your mainsail. Often you can pick them up very cheaply, second hand. It's not a sail you pull out very often, but you know when you are pulling it out, you know you need it, and they're built really robustly. You know these sails don't fail. Your gear will fail. You know I've had you know parts of the rigging fail before my trysail failed. And you know, in my case, I have a mizzen as well, so you know I have a reef in the mizzen. But you know, that's only if you've got a ketch. Big air sails, you know, I don't know whether you need big air sails. You know, you need to be able to use them properly. And if you're going to carry big air sails, you need to carry a spinnaker pole. I see a lot of people don't carry a spinnaker pole, and I don't understand why not. If you've got a genoa, why wouldn't you be able to pole out that sail and run downwind, or at least a long way towards downwind? That to me is ridiculous. And if you've got a spinnaker pole, then you can run a Code Zero, you can run a Jenica or a spinnaker. And a lot of these sails are not terribly expensive. You pick them up second hand, and even if we're talking about buying sails second hand, you can pick up. If you're just running a good quality Genoa, you can pick up a second hand jib. Throw it in the locker. If you're going to do that run from Fiji down to New Zealand, well, take off the Genoa and put on the jib. Protect that expensive sail you've got, and run your heavy jib. That's what I do every season. When I leave New Zealand, I've got a jib on, and when I get up into the the islands, I put my Genoa back on if the weather's light enough. And before I head south, I put the jib back on. If I've got enough crew, I might even do it mid sail. I don't tend to change sails a lot when I'm on the ocean, apart from Jenicas and spinnakers and things like that. But yeah, I see a lot of boats that don't even have a spinnaker pole, and I don't understand why you wouldn't go sailing offshore without a spinnaker pole. It does my head in. Like it's just lazy, and it's like they haven't taken any time to learn how to sail, and to make life easy for themselves. You can get a lot of miles running dead downwind. Even in heavy weather, I've got my jib poled out or furled in and poled out on one side on a spinnaker pole, and I've got the staysail or the storm jib poled out through the end of the boom on the other side. And as the weather increases or decreases, I can add or subtract my furling jib. And it's a good sail combination. It allows me to sail downwind, and I've done it in up to 60 knots, comfortable in Tintin, and I'm getting probably 8s and 9s. It's not super comfortable, it's quite rolly. It's interesting to discuss when you're sailing to these remote locations is sail fabric. You're seeing more and more, expensive vessels with hybrid fabrics. That's okay. If you've got loads of money, you can fly in a sail from anywhere. It doesn't really matter. But if you're on a budget, on a cruising boat, you don't want expensive hybrid fabrics that can't be repaired. You want to be able to, think of your boat like a bit of a tractor. And, you're in a place where there's lots of tractors. So if I want to get a sail repaired up in Fiji or Tonga, Wallis and Futuna, Vanuatu, I need a material that can be repaired, and that's Dacron. Dacron lasts really well. It's a good quality sailing fabric. It's easy to repair, and anybody in any one of these locations with an industrial sewing machine can stitch it up. You can put a patch on, and they can get you to the next location where you can find a sailmaker. Because often you won't find a sailmaker in some of these locations. You might in Fiji, you probably won't in Tonga, you won't in Wallis, you won't in Vanuatu, you won't in Newcastle, depending on how the situation is over there with riots, etc. You might in French Polynesia, but they're not that common. But Australia, New Zealand, there's plenty of them, and parts of Asia, of course. So Dacron is the sail fabric of choice. You don't want to get suckered into buying an exotic fabric for a offshore cruising boat. You want something that can be repaired in remote locations by somebody with a canvas sewing machine. And on that, we also need to have repair kits. Like, I'm looking at people in marinas, or they're hanging on a mooring, or they're just anchoring in a river. I go, how you doing? And they go, what happened to your sails? And I go, no, I've sent them off to Australia to get repaired. They don't even have the ability to sew up their sail on the deck. I have sat on the deck of my boat sewing my main back together halfway to Papua New Guinea because I caught a batten. It ripped the sail in half. And me and a mate, we spent 6 hours stitching it back together. It wasn't fun. We were rolling like a pig, but we got it back together and we continued sailing. There's no reason why we should turn around. And, on board Tintin, I carry sewing thread, I carry a bunch of needles, I carry a sailmaker's palm, some pliers to pull the needles through. I carry a sewing awl, which is a device for canvas work. It's quite handy. I also have sticky-backed sail fabric, and I carry spare Dacron, like lengths of it, so I can use it as patches if I need to. And I have had to sew the clue back onto my jib in the Southern Ocean, or reinforce it with actual rope because it was getting ripped out. I've sewn the seams of my jib several times because it's getting old. And it's really handy. I mean, even last season I was sewing my Genoa back together. One of the seams started to fail. So sat down, had a couple of beers, and a couple of hours later I'd reinforce the seam so I could continue using the sail. It's not that hard. It's a bit monotonous, but why wouldn't you have that product on board so that you can save yourself all the arse pain of sitting in a location while your sails get sent off to Australia and New Zealand and you don't know if they're ever going to come back. Things get caught in customs in these countries and you may never see them again. And again, that's why you would have a second sail. Another interesting discussion point with buying a sailboat is the quality of the sails. Like I've got mates who do a lot of racing and they're just really cruising racers. They're not dedicated racers. They've got a cruising boat, but they're changing sails, like every 5 years. And I think they just get caught up in the bullshit of the competitive spirit of needing the best and the best. Some of the sails they throw away are sails I'll use for another 5 years because there's nothing wrong with them. Like I said, I've got 50-year-old sails that I'm still using and they're perfectly okay. I take them in every year or two and I get the seams resewn. Sail makers look at me and they go, like, that sail's older than I am. I go, yep, and it's still working harder than you are. And I get them resewn and I put them back on the boat and come the start of the season, up they go and off I go again. I think my jib's about rooted, like it's a 50-year-old jib and it is done a lot of hard work. I think when you're buying a boat, it's handy if you look at the boat with a surveyor and a crusty old salt. Not a racing guy, get someone who's a cruising guy, who can look at your sails and go, yep, they've still got another 5 years in them, or nope, they're rooted. Because if you haven't done a lot of sailing and you don't have the experience to look at your sails and know whether they're in good condition or not, you don't know whether you're getting value. And if you've got a sailmaker on board, he's going to tell you they're rooted because he wants to sell you some new sails. Everybody's a salesman. But a crusty old salt who's done a lot of miles will tell you whether those sails are good. Even if you've got to pay someone from the yacht club or a mate, get him down there and get an opinion. Once you've bought the boat, you can take those sails off and then get them strengthened at the sailmaker. It only costs a couple $100 to strengthen a jib or a Genoa. Even your mate's normally not more than $500 to have it strengthened and checked over, maybe even a couple $100 if there's just a couple of seams. So, I ran into a guy up in New Caledonia, just bought a catamaran. Nice guy, nice family, and it was, decent cat, decent size, spent a bit of money on it, and he had a lot of work to do. He had problems with motors, gearboxes, sails, and he was talking about replacing the sails, like the main and the Genoa, or the jib on that. And, you're going to drop 20 grand replacing a main on a decent 45-foot cat. So I thought, hey, I'll go and have a look. We opened up the sail bag, because he hadn't even opened the sail bag, and they were still in really good nick. Like there might have been a couple of little rub marks or patches that needed to be, repaired or strengthened. But, he had another 5 years in those sails. And that's just because he didn't have enough experience looking at sails. It's nothing against the guy, he's a nice guy. But, that's why you want to have a crusty old bugger around who's done a few miles when you're looking at, your new boat. It's handy for a lot of parts of a new boat, to be perfectly honest, having a second eye look at it. But sails are a big investment, so when you're buying a boat, you want to try and get decent sails. They don't have to be the flashiest, newest sails, and even older sails will get you across the ocean. When I was coming back from Fiji a couple of years ago, and I got caught in a cyclone. I tore my main, my mizzen, my staysail, and I was planning to replace my my mizzen when I got back to New Zealand and put a new one on. And I thought, I've got another couple of years out of the main. As it happens, my main got ripped in half, my mizzen got torn, the staysail got torn, so I had the staysail repaired, had a patch put up the front of it. It doesn't look very pretty, but it still does its job. I got a new main made because I needed to, and I was humming and hawing about the mizzen, and someone had thrown out a sail, like off a 30-foot boat, in the marina. I was just sitting in the top of the bin. I had a look at it, and had a couple of little wear patches, but I lopped off the bottom reef, and it was a perfect sail for my mizzen. I just got it a new reef point added, and that sail is still on my boat. It's got a couple of little patches. I will get another season or two out of that sail. Like, it doesn't look super flash, but I don't give a shit. I'm sailing in the Pacific. I'm still doing my 7s and 8s and 9s, and that sail has already served somebody, and now it's serving me. And next year I'll probably put a brand new mizzen on. But it's about not spending a ridiculous amount of money on things you don't need to. And on that point, I think one thing is overlooked by a lot of sailors is UV protection. Now, if you're in certain parts of the world, you don't really have to worry about UV protection that much. But if you live in the southern parts of Australia and New Zealand, UV protection is a big thing. And even up in the Pacific, like, you'll feel that the sun just beating into you. And one of the problems is UV bags that are not providing enough protection for your sail. And I see it regularly. People are not protecting their sails. I do it myself. I forget to put the sail bag or sail cover on my main, and and it's ridiculous. Like, it's a big investment. I should be covering it more regularly, particularly when I'm not using it. So I think when you get a sail cover made or a boom bag made, make sure it's lined. I see people making them out of light coloured material. Light coloured material doesn't really provide as much protection as dark coloured material. So more and more we are lining our sail covers with a darker fabric, UV protection fabric, and that's to try and protect our sails so they don't get UV damaged. There's a number of cases where people have got a new sail, it's only lasted a couple of years, and the UV's got into it and started to rot the stitching out. So if you're leaving your main on, cover it with the UV fabric and then cover it with the sail cover as well to give it more protection. You still want the air getting through, but you want to protect from the UV. And take your fucking jib and genoa off. I mean, how many lazy fuckers leave their jibs and genoas on the track? They leave their boat for 6 months on the hard, in a marina, and they leave the sails up. That sail is probably 5 or 10 grand. It's just sitting up there getting rotted by UV. When it takes an hour, max, probably half an hour to pull it down, you flake it as you're pulling it down, fold it up, stick it in the locker, and your sail will give you a lot more life. I do it every season, pull it down, throw it in the locker, start of the season. I look at the conditions, jib or genoa. Generally, if I'm leaving from New Zealand, going north, it's a jib. It takes 30 minutes, put the boat back in the water, go down, head up in the wind, sails up, good to go. And it's not that bloody hard, and that's me doing it by myself half the time. So if you've got a crew, even easier. So pull your sails down, don't be lazy. There are probably the main things to talk about sails. I just think, the key one if you're coming across the Pacific is have spare sails. If you've got a genoa on, carry a jib. Carry a storm jib. Work out how to carry that on your boat. At the very least, have a genoa that you can furl. And if you blow out your jib, that you can furl if you blow out your genoa. There are plenty of options for storm jibs as well, and you should carry one. I'm a big fan of trysails. Even modern sloops can carry a trysail. There's plenty of arrangements to put it on. There's loads of second-hand trysails out there. You can pick them up anywhere, and you can modify it for your boat. Big blow, put the trysail up, protect your main. At the very least, have 3 or 4 reefs in your main, and you'll be much better off. Hope that helps. See you next time.